Hi, David. That was really interesting. I've just got a two-part question, really. When White Teeth came out, they said it was kind of a celebratory cosmopolitanism, and she recently said that she was just trying to state how the world is, how she saw it. So it relates to kind of like Hayek's idea of actually existing cosmopolitanism or rooted cosmopolitanism, etc. There's lots of different names for it. I just want to know what you think she's trying to do by rooting something in locality rather than having this kind of celebration of cosmopolitanism. Well, she is actually trying to say it's a fact of life in London now. And just the second idea of your term, worldly localisms, just how that relates to like Robertson's idea of globalization. And
who that is?
Robertson, the idea of global, the merge of local and global, and how it relates to other paradigms in 21st century literature at the moment. Like Adam Kelly's got this idea of American literature where he calls it sincerity, and how that relates to I mean, Peter Boxall would say it's like an ethical term in fiction now, and Peter Charles just says it's a return to ethics. How these different paradigms kind of relate to each other, what's going on? Are they all the same thing?
No. I'll get back to you about the others. No, I mean, there's a sort of multiple tiers your question, but I'll try and take the first one. I mean, it's interesting that Smith's kind of says, well, that's just how I wanted to see it. Because I saw that, White Teeth, maybe was very precocious, but also a Dickensian kind of novel, but also just in its own way, maybe we will look back on it in 10 years' time as something which has its own sincerity to it, even though it's been sort of, James Wood, came up with that rather nasty label, hysterical realism for it, which doesn't quite do justice to, I think, the earnestness of a project, which actually continues on through a fiction. And I think the reversion, but I do think, though, it does have an ebullient register to it that is in marked contrast to NW, which seems to me so uncompromising. Even though Dave made a brilliant case for it being very nostalgic, I do think there's a kind of uncompromising kind of what we used to call gritty realism about it. And it's interesting the fact that she's also trying to generate a certain level of discomfiture in her readers by writing this overlong novel, which is often impossible to follow sometimes, and experimenting at the level of syntax and structure in ways that are deliberately bewildering you. But in relation to the other ones, the new sincerity. You could group Smith into this kind of larger new sincerity movement, which could also be called post-irony, where which is both formal insofar as writers are refusing to kind of buy into the kind of self-referential, self-parodying maneuvers of postmodern fiction, and are trying to find a way of articulating social issues that aren't premised on this constant perpetual interrogation of the possibilities of representation, which seems to me to be at the heart of postmodern fiction. But the ethical term seems to be a much more interpretive thing. It seems to be like there has been an ethical term, but that's less to do with necessarily how fiction is being produced than how it's being received. That's not to say, of course, that you couldn't productively group together writers who are staging ethical dilemmas at the level of plot. But then you could equally go back to Iris Murdoch and see that as a kind of continuum, going from her kind of moral fiction through to the present. So I think the particularity of the ethical turn is an interpretive maneuver, where which is going back to Nick's point earlier, is a kind of reflection of our sort of post-theory moment, I think. Yeah.
Three short points. If White Teeth is Dickensian, so too clearly is NW. I mean, the kind of trudge or tromp or yomp or whatever you want to call it, of attempted escape by Nathan and Natalie is clearly modelled around the Heath and so on. So it's clearly modelled on Bill Sykes. This is a kind of very strong Dickensian illusion. Yeah. And there are other elements of Dickens in the novel. It recurs. It's quite subtle, but it's there. If postmodernism ever had its day, because I don't believe it ever did, some of us were entirely sceptical of its claims right throughout its supposed, intellectual hegemony. Its real problem is that in its irony and in its postures, it elevates the intellect of the commentator and the so-called intellectual observer above that of any other position, and it does it implicitly, and it however playful it is, it poses itself unconsciously as understanding and comprehending and deconstructing the world, which it clearly doesn't. And that, I think that's why you don't need a new sincerity. There are always writers or a post-irony, because the irony was always fake and a posture, and the sincerity was always potentially there within the novel in a complex way. I mean, B.S. Johnson and others have influenced NW as well.
Absolutely.
And they're there, and they've already predicted the kind of failings of the postmodern. So I think it's a failing of the critical class, not the authorial class in many ways. But one interesting final thing is that in your St. Paul's in one box, the Gherkin in another, there's a kind of a playfulness about localism with Smith, because the final sentence that you've used is impossible. You can't walk back down that hill, because the road at that point is level. It does eventually dip towards Highgate Tube, but it doesn't go down the hill. There are very steep stone steps. So she's playing with you to see whether you understand the landscape. So the specificity is a kind of playfulness on her part too, because she's being quite, in a minor way, deceiving there. You know, it's an impossibility. You know, you wouldn't just go back down the hill. You descend down very steep steps, which are quite vertiginous. So there's a kind of odyssey there, isn't there? There's something strange going on in the way she deceives you. So that's a kind of almost like a kind of undermining of the postmodern and saying, well, you know, it's not playful, it's just deceit.
Well, yeah, you could say that, Phil. Discuss, yeah. I mean, I'm less interested in sort of like, I'm thinking about localism as an ethos rather than sort of topographical
But it is a kind
specificity.
Of
but it is a topographic. Yes, absolutely.
She deceives you in other places as well.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's very yes, because I mean, some people thought that the Heath scene where they go across the Heath was totally farcical as well. You know, it had that kind of like pantomimic kind of quality to it. You know.
Bill Sykes.
Yeah. And Johnson, of course. I mean, you know, he played with location. You know, I mean, you. So yeah, there is that, and it's Hardy-esque because it is taking the metaphoricity of place and rolling with it, definitely. But what interests me about Smith is the sort of the use of such location in ways that are kind of refused. She seems to be refusing to kind of either romanticize them or to stage some sort of ethical lesson there, and it's much more oblique, I think. And maybe maybe an upshot of the obliquity is she deliberately puts in errors like that.
It's kind of like a dialectic.
Yeah.
I sort of feel qualified to talk about Zadie Smith's localism because I grew up in northwest London and I went to school in Willesden. Willesden has long been, since the 19th century, cosmopolitan and multicultural. That's not 21st century. Yeah. The real change that's happening in areas not just like Willesden and Kilburn is gentrification. And inequality, and I think it's important not to let class slip. I don't sound like a vulgar Marxist, but I think you have to talk about the impact of gentrification on any major city. I'm not qualified in any way to talk about Lahiri, whose work I don't know. But knowing something about contemporary Indian fiction is also important to look at the impact of mallification, the growth of the Indian middle class, and gentrification in some parts of some cities.
Well, that's what, I mean, it thoroughly annoys me about Lahiri sometimes. You think, this is just middle class people, they've got the money to travel everywhere. They just pop back to India, they come back and they're living in a massive New England, townhouse. It's a thoroughly comfortable environment. Everybody's got two lovely kids, a car, they go to big weddings, But I have friends from Calcutta, and and he said it's very authentic. What she's creating is actually a very close representation to a certain kind of, like you say, immigrants, but middle class. That is actually very well rendered, however uncomfortable and privileged it seems within the context of thinking about cosmopolitanism. On Smith, on the point about Smith, I agree. I think that I think that part of that transition from On Beauty, which was thoroughly kind of middle class, I think, was very uncomfortable in treatment of class via Forster, to NW, but particularly to the Embassy of Cambodia, where she really is talking about everyday disenfranchisement that is happening every day. That it's normalised, and that is part of our kind, that it's becoming invisible. So you have the Derwell households with their servants, and that is kind of normalised, in a horrendously everyday way.
In that LRB article.
Yes. What draws attention to class? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And horrendous. I mean, how much do you need to earn to live in former districts? So I think it's becoming much more central to her work. Yeah.
I guess this is really related to that. It seems to me that localism is often identified in terms of working class politics and the aesthetic of really realism. They're sort of seen as overlapping, but here it's a localism, but there's clearly distinct class positions involved in it. And I just wonder if you comment.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there is. I mean, I think there always has. To a certain extent, there always has. But I agree. I mean, if you trace it through Alan Slisso, the Anglo-Young generation, even through Philip Roth as a kind of localist writer in his own way, Newark. But yeah, it does have that lineage going through to Pat Barker, and then it has a complication. So I think, but what worries me about that is it gets attached to a certain kind of aesthetic as well, which is the realism, which is the realist aesthetic. And that needn't be the case, as I hope I've shown, that actually the most unlikely and everyday places become these kind of catalysts for formal innovation. Some of the most innovative writers happen to be the most localist or interested in scrutinizing the seemingly mundane. And it's how we weave that into our own critical practice that's the question. That's why I ended on that slightly polemical note about what do we make of these moments. If Zadie Smith isn't actually aestheticizing the local for its own sake, if she's doing something more ethically responsible than that, how might that actually inform our own critical priorities? Yeah.
Okay, excellent. We can carry on more questions at the break. Please join me in thanking David, please. Thank you.
Cheers.